I would like to introduce this panel, Discrimination in the Field of Education. Our chair is from Istanbul University, Department of Sociology, and he has worked on identity in education and handling conflict in the field of education in different areas, multidimensional approaches against discrimination, and is one of his books, among many others, Kenan Çayır, the chair of this panel. I'd like to welcome him. Good morning, Merve. Good morning, everyone. So Merve started off with a question. What a provocative question. Do I recall any discriminatory discourse during the lessons, classes in my childhood? I teach discrimination in the university classes, so we discussed that too. I remember some phrases, for example, "You're just a girl, what can you do?" This is just an example, of course. In all walks of life, we are witnessing different examples of discrimination. Now, coming to today's panel, we will take a look at the situation in Turkey and Germany. But let me make a brief introduction before handing the microphone over to my first speaker. Discrimination in education reminds usually us of the solutions about the education system. In Turkey, everybody says education is a must. Education is a must. However, unfortunately, education itself sometimes gives rise to discrimination itself. So education sometimes isn't solving the problem at all, but causing discrimination itself. We have to be careful with this. We have more and more challenges in the field of education in recent years. We have social problems along with education problems. These are coupled with the migration flow that impacted Turkey significantly, also Germany. I'm referring to the civil war in Syria, the migrant flow. So this increased the burden on the education system. We need to find a way to embrace differences. We need to find a way to coexist. We need to build common norms and practices. This is difficult for all of us. We will have two speakers with two different perspectives. One speaker is from Germany. Kollender is our first speaker. She will talk about the approaches, tactics, and conflicts in Berlin, Germany, regarding the migrant societies. She's from Hamburg Helmut Schmidt University. She is a postdoctoral researcher in this university. And in Istanbul Policy Center, she conducted research last year and this year. She worked on inequality in education, racism in education, and its impact in the education system, the role of teachers. She is covering those areas in her research. So we will listen to Ellen in the first place. She will introduce her research in 15 minutes. Ellen, it's over to you.
So I'm very delighted for the opportunity to present some findings of my research here today. My research focuses in general on discrimination in the German and Turkish education system. And my former research, I analyzed the entanglement of different forms of discrimination, which especially students and parents with an ascribed migration or Muslim background experience in Germany. And in my current research project, I identify strategies of civil society initiatives that aim to stimulate the development of schools in Germany and Turkey that is critical to discrimination. And this research is based on case studies in Berlin and Istanbul, where I conducted qualitative interviews with representatives of initiatives that are active in the field of education and anti-discrimination. And the question that I would like to address here today, unfortunately, now it's working. I would like to address here today is what can we learn from current approaches, strategies and conflicts of civil society initiatives in Berlin when creating schools that are sensitive to discrimination. Yeah, why do I consider Berlin as kind of a role model here, because in Berlin in recent years, various developments took place that have led to a greater recognition of discrimination in the Berlin school system. For example, as the first German federal state, Berlin adopted an anti-discrimination law that particularly aims to protect against discrimination in state institutions like schools. And in 2016, an anti-discrimination officer for Berlin schools was appointed by the Berlin Senate Administration for Education, and the Senate also started to support counseling services for parents and students who are subject to discrimination in schools. And I see these attempts to institutionalize protection against discrimination. I'm very sorry. Okay, now I got it. So I see these attempts to institutionalize the protection against discrimination in school as a result of a decades-long critical movement in Berlin. And this movement is led mainly by migrant organizations, parents, educators, and other activists of color. And they intervene time and again in schools and education policy in order to raise awareness for discrimination and to encourage a broader transformation of the Berlin school system. So in the following, I'd like to take a closer look at this movement. And first, I'd like to give you a very quick historical contextualization. So public complaints against discrimination in Berlin schools gained momentum in the early 1990s. And criticism was mainly directed against two political measures. Firstly, the so-called foreigner classes that were segregated classes for students of non-German, mainly Turkish origin. And these classes were set up in public schools if the proportion of foreign students in a class was more than 25%, according to the regulations in Berlin that time. And secondly, the critique was directed against monolingual culture of Berlin schools, which did not encourage multilingualism and the use of first languages other than German in school. And the foreigner classes and this monolingual culture of schools were first at the center of the criticism voiced primarily by Turkish parents associations and migrant self-organizations in the 1990s. So in collaboration with welfare organizations, they advocated a cultural, intercultural opening of schools. And this critique finally also led to a change. So in the mid-1990s, the foreigner classes were abolished in Berlin, and a couple of years later, multilingualism in Berlin schools was officially recognized. So teachers were encouraged and also partly obliged to attend trainings for German as a second language. And after these first important institutional changes, the movement against discrimination in Berlin schools has diversified in the course of the last 20 years, as did its criticism and demands on Berlin's education policy. And more parts of the society became involved in the debate about discrimination, such as refugee initiatives, Sinti and Roma, Afro-diasporic, Jewish, Muslim groups, some of them students, parents, teachers, social workers in school. And many of these individuals have and initiatives today position themselves not primarily as migrants or minorities, but as new Germans or new German organizations, which is also the name of a German-wide network of about 130 initiatives that was founded a couple of years ago in Berlin. And this network also demands for some radical reforms in the German education system, as they say, and under the heading of inclusive education requires protection against discrimination. The network demands, for example, to reform the school laws of all federal states in order to make them more sensitive to the right of non-discrimination in education. They also demand to establish independent information, counseling, and complaints services and bodies for students and parents who experience discrimination in school. And they also demand to introduce obligatory trainings for teachers on discrimination and anti-discriminatory approaches in school, as well as empowerment workshops for students and their parents. So these new German organizations advocate here a holistic approach that does not only focus on a single discriminating student or teacher. Rather, this approach is interlinking measures against discrimination on the structural, institutional, and individual level. And in this approach, anti-discrimination measures do not focus only on one particular form of discrimination, but on an understanding that different forms of discrimination often intersect, and by this lead to very specific experiences of discrimination. And in this respect, especially the concept of intersectionality sensitized in recent years the debate about discrimination in Berlin schools, and as it is especially promoted by the Center for Intersectional Justice in Berlin and the Berlin Initiative for Intersectional Pedagogy. Yeah, and even though there is quite a broad consensus among the civil society initiatives regarding the measures required for school development that is critical of discrimination, the strategies pursued by the initiatives differ in some respects. And a closer look at what I've called so far the movement here shows that this movement consists of quite diverse actors who pursue quite different motivations and strategies. And these strategies are not always coordinated, which leads to conflicts within this movement and also might cause a situation in which common goals are being missed. So, and I'd like to illustrate this by taking the example of two initiatives. Both initiatives especially follow the aim to establish an independent complaints body for students and parents in Berlin. That means an independent body that should not only offer counseling for students and parents that experience discrimination, but also should support students and parents, for example, in taking legal steps against it. And to achieve this goal, there are some differences in the approaches between these two initiatives. So Initiative A, rather from an activist perspective, wanted to push for institutional change from outside of the system, so to speak, while Initiative B very early on tried to push for change from a position supported and funded by state institutions and by state authorities. So, and both strategies have different potentials and face specific challenges, and in some respect they compete and conflict with each other. And this is not at all, I think, particular for Berlin. Rather, the initiatives can, I think, exemplify similar challenges and dynamics elsewhere, which might give us a basis for discussion on how to overcome such challenges. So, and that's why I like to go a bit more in depth on these strategies and challenges the two initiatives in Berlin follow and face. So, Initiative A is an open network of people from various anti-discrimination organizations, parent initiatives, and other activist groups in Berlin. And the initiative sees itself as an NGO that finances its activities mainly through donations. What are their strategies to promote such a complaints body? First of all, the initiative aimed to raise awareness in the Berlin school community for discrimination and also for the necessity for such a complaints body by, for example, organizing information events, conferences, and by publishing legal opinions and policy papers. And secondly, they try to involve politicians in the public debates on discrimination and in the events they organize on this topic in order to win political allies. And in addition to this political lobbying, the initiative continuously networks with other NGOs and important actors from civil society in order to increase the initiative's power in the educational discourse. And with these strategies, the initiative has raised great awareness among politicians and the public for the need of a comprehensive protection against discrimination in school, and especially its independence from external donors and from state structures allowed them to develop kind of an ideal of a complaint system, which more and more is acknowledged also by political actors. But the initiative also faces challenges. So, for example, its limited resources due to its voluntary structures restricts campaigning and lobbying to a space that hardly extends beyond Berlin. And the objectives of the initiative are labeled by some actors as quite unrealistic. So some schools and authorities do consider the initiative as too radical and are not open for collaborating with these initiative. And despite also the strong efforts of the initiative, a Berlin-wide independent complaints body has not been
established. Son 5 dakika. Last 5 minutes.
Not been, okay, thank you. Not been established yet. So a representative of the initiative explains this as follows. She says, there is the level of politics and the other level is the senator and her house. If you don't have the senator and her house on your side, it becomes difficult because she says, as long as I'm the senator, there will be no independent complaints body. So this quote shows that as long as the decisive political representatives are stonewalling, the initiative does not seem to be able to achieve its main objective, so to say, from their position from outside of the system. So who is Initiative B? Initiative B consists of members of a larger educational organization in Berlin, and their initiative and work is primarily funded by the Education Authority. And what are their strategies? First of all, in order to obtain funding from the state, the initiative strongly emphasized the originality of their project. That means it positioned itself as the first independent information and complaints office in Berlin. And at the same time, the initiative claimed to be a mediating and moderating actor between schools, school authorities, and students affected by discrimination. And this positioning as a mediator seemed to be important in order not to appear too radical and to win the trust of important political and educational authorities. And besides, the initiative tried to develop a proximity to state actors in order to be able to explore the possibilities and the limits of a complaints body from kind of within state structures in a realistic way, as they say. And they also use their proximity to the state, for example, to the anti-discrimination officer in Berlin, in order to raise influence and its respect among schools and education authorities. And here I quote again, this means that in certain cases we consult the anti-discrimination commissioner, and many schools in Berlin already know, okay, we can't ignore them completely, they would otherwise turn to the anti-discrimination officer. So in recent years, Initiative B has reached that it is widely known and respected as a partner of schools and of school authorities. And by using the insights the initiative has gained in its collaboration with state institutions, it was able to identify gaps in protection against discrimination in the education system. And by this, the initiative was also able to test different possibilities to raise complaints against discrimination in school. And in addition, the long-term funding from the Senate allows for sustainable anti-discrimination work. But also here, this initiative face several challenges. For example, the initiative self-marketing, like we are the first, the only counseling and complaints body in Berlin, has caused discontent among other initiatives, especially among those who have providing information and counseling against discrimination already for many years. And actually, it were these initiatives that created a wide political awareness for discrimination in school, from which Initiative B has benefited significantly. And apart from this, there's also mistrust by other initiatives regarding Initiative B's concept of a complaint body, which from other initiatives' point of view operates too close to state structures and does not truly act independently. And also Initiative B has to realize that even it has so far succeeded in setting up an anti-discrimination information and counseling, it has not succeeded yet in setting up an independent complaints body with the appropriate legal power. Yeah, so what is the message to draw from this example? I think this analysis shows that crucial aspects to initiate a reform of the education.
Ellen, toparlayabilir misin? Could you please wrap up? I mean, in 2 minutes?
I finished in 1 minute. So that is critical of discrimination. So, and these crucial elements are the development of the discursive power and the building of allies with other civil society, as well as with political actors. And this requires patience, communication skills, and also the willingness to compromise. And at the same time, there's always this danger for the initiatives to appear too radical and unrealistic. And it seems very sensitive how goals and ideas are communicated to political and official actors. And it seems important here to put oneself kind of in the shoes of political decision makers and their mostly very solution-oriented logic. And in addition, there is the danger that the long, voluntary, strenuous work of activist lobbying leads to frustration, and this can translate into resentment towards other initiatives and a certain dogmatism. And I think here it seems to be very important to direct the criticism not inwards, but outwards. So it seems important to understand that also outer circumstances, like funding mechanisms, which often put a pressure on the actors to perform in front of the political actors in a way that is not always in line with the actual needs of their work. And here it seems important to watch out also for political stonewalling, which may provoke conflicts between the civil society actors and that might put the state actors in a position from which they can use the civil society against each other and weaken their criticism in the institutional framework. So last but not least, I think in order to sort this out, a joint critical reflection and understanding of these external circumstances may help to raise awareness and understanding for each other's struggles and limitations. And I think more resources could be invented in joint professional mediation and joint reflection of each other's work and strategies, and in exchanging information and knowledge between the actors in order to strengthen solidarity within civil society. So thank you very much for listening.
We would like to thank you, Ellen, because you have talked about the challenges, and the question remains on how to have inclusive schools. And the German organizations, you talked about various initiatives, they have already manage this. There are some questions that spring to my mind, but I can also see questions in the chat box. So you can continue typing your questions in the chat box. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Nil. She is from BOMOVO, which stands for Network for Sports and Bodily Movement for Vulnerable Groups. So this is an initiative for social empowerment, and she is the co-founder. And she teaches at Bilgi University on sports for social change. And if I'm not mistaken, last year you also published a book for anti-racist education, and I think it will be really good to share its link so that our participants can also download this book. You have 15 minutes. Over to you. Thank you very much, Mr. Professor. This is what our moderator has just mentioned, anti-racist teacher education guideline. And as the association BOMOVO, we developed this guideline in 2019. And our main purpose is to offer some materials and guidelines for teachers for counseling their students who are subject to discrimination. We organized workshops through which we shared these guidelines with the teachers. Afterwards, we conducted some surveys, we held one-to-one interviews, and based on this information, we tried to understand discrimination cases in Istanbul in different districts. And at the same time, we also made an effort to understand how children subject to discrimination do feel. So we have also identified those feelings as symptoms. Earlier on, you said that this is a structural problem. Yes, this is a structural problem, and we did not. Our starting point was not focusing on subjects and jump into judgments or conclusions, but we try to understand the bigger picture, the structure that enables a discrimination. In order to do that, we benefited from the peace studies of Juan Galtung. We worked on his theories, and Galtung makes an analysis of structural violence and cultural violence. And we looked into racist practices within schools as cultural violence. And for the other type of violence, we also looked into the conventional or biological racism. So we also have this spholometric analysis and skin color scale, but these are the physical, these are practices linked to physical features. That's why we decided to focus on cultural violence, and we tried to uncover the cultural violence or neo-racism practices. As I have mentioned, we have conducted surveys among teachers. So the first form of discrimination is among students, from student to student, and the second one is from teacher to student. And the third one is between teachers and parents. And most of the discrimination cases take place in school corridors or schoolyards, in other words, in common spaces in schools. And verbal assaults containing hateful content is a wide phenomenon between the school administration and the students. Every now and then, teachers overhear certain expressions. And by the way, we made use of Öykü Doğan's illustrations in order to depict this. And I would like to share this illustration with you. We know who they are. They are always a menace. They cannot really learn. So why do we waste our time by making effort to teach them? And the students are not really able to express themselves. So these are the expressions of teachers, quote unquote. And they also talk about Syrian students being disabled, for instance. And also, during these conversations, there is a mentioning of the name of the nation that these students belong, and they also make use of their intonation and stress. For instance, the word Syrian can easily become a swear word to define any dark-colored student, or the word gypsy can be used to refer to a thief, and used in an anonymous way to thief. And we have also heard of cases where students are subject to unfair practices when it comes to their scoring. And we can also see examples where teachers are implying that if the students do not behave, they will be sent back to their country. And then there's another aspect that the teachers we have interviewed have mentioned about the problematic practices, because there is a perception of Syrians as a plague and they should be getting rid of this problem. In another case, the Syrian student cannot express himself or herself in Turkish, but the school principal responds that this is Turkey, you have to be speaking in Turkish. And also talking about the Kurdish students. The Kurdish students are considered without mental capacities and not performing well, and they are being subject to more disciplinary measures. But it seems that there is not really an effort to rehabilitate those Kurdish students because there is already a conclusion that they don't have the capacity. So teachers see this as wasting of time. And in the system of meritocracy, they are trying to overcome all these invisible barriers, and hence society gets lost in the historicity. When it comes to Roma students, they are completely out of the system. They're completely pushed out of the system. And when we ask teachers about the Roma students, it becomes obvious that they are not there. They are not even present. So there is this constant absence of Roma students in the narratives of the teachers. And we can here talk about the aversive racism, which is a result of a number of processes, including cognitive, motivational, and social cultural processes. This is how Gardner and Dovidio defines aversive racism. And this applies very much to Roma students in schools. They are not seen in the school. Their presence is not really appreciated or valued. And then let us talk about the Syrian students. And the Syrian students are subject to differentialist new racism, as Taguev will put it. So this perspective defines different walks of life or lifestyles as unchangeable, and that in an antagonistic way. So the word Syria also used to differentiate the students. Earlier on, I have talked about the symptoms and how all those discriminatory practices have an impact on students. So if we look into the details of the symptoms, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to look into the feelings instead of just singular behaviors. And by the way, I'm not talking about the psychological symptoms, but these are social contracts that are being built around cultural hegemony issues. So the first symptom is the erasure of the identity. So the students do not see their own identity or underestimate or undervalue their own identities, again, in the words of their teachers. The second symptom is the erasure of the language to render his or her identity invisible in that space. For instance, what one teacher said was that the students were whispering to one another in Arabic. No matter how much effort I put to create an inclusive environment, a multilingual environment, Syrian students, they still would prefer to speak in Turkish. And another issue that teachers raised was about the Kurdish students and how they were deprived of reading books in their mother tongue. Another symptom is about students' self-perception, and they consider themselves as ugly or stupid, and they do not value their own thoughts. Another symptom is to do with physical violence. Even though the students know the answer to the questions, they would refrain from raising their hands, or they are constantly watching their physical appearance. And the fourth symptom is about the students' reaction to racialization by means of physical violence. And this is mostly because the students are not able to express themselves and they're expected to communicate in a language that they do not know. There is also this perception. The teachers consider that students are inclined to violence, but no one really talks about why those students are inclined to violence. What is the reason behind it? In fact, this is a stereotype we can see in all civilization or evangelizing missions, how racialization is used to produce violence. And the fifth symptom is the feeling of gratitude. The sixth one is to do with the nostalgia or the sadness the students feel. For instance, one teacher mentioned that I could feel that students are emotional, so sensitive they can easily cry. Another symptom is reacting against injustices. And students show their reactions through words or sometimes their bodily movements. For instance, Fatma, one of the students, is a big girl. She has also she's also tall and she wants to mostly sit in front. And she's also blocking the view of other students. But Fatma's message is in fact that she wants to prove that she's present there and she wants to be visible. Another symptom I would like to talk about is grouping. Some students say that Syrians are mostly playing games among themselves, they're helping one another and they're supporting one another and if needed, translating between different languages. There is one more symptom, which is disappearance. This is something that mostly relates to Roma students. And we can see that only when we see when we try to figure out what teachers say in between the lines. So there are Roma students, but their identities are not really being talked about. They are invisible. They are quiet and calm. One of the teachers defines those Roma students as calm and silent. And the very last symptom that we have observed throughout our interviews is about their limitations. So this includes a physical limitation, but it also includes a more psychological limitation because the students are also feeling withdrawn and they are also feeling quite squeezed in the space for the purpose of self-protection. For instance, one of the teachers said that Syrian girls always play right in front of the counselor's room in the corridor. So this is rather a narrow corridor, and the Syrian kids, as they play, they are not really exposed to other students. And sometimes they can be hesitant. Even the teacher is already in the class, the Syrian students hesitating to enter the class. Yes, 2 more minutes. So in conclusion, as Muhammed Charkwa said, the cultural racism is being reproduced in schools, which has great implications on both teachers and students. But this intertwined relations should also be seen within the racism without racist theory. And the main purpose of this study is to uncover how cultural racism works in schools And our study also aims at offering some support mechanisms or devising some support mechanisms for children as well as all other individuals who suffer from these structural problems. And I believe that everyone should take this as a citizens' initiative and their responsibility, and there should be more research into this area. Thank you very much, Nil.